The unseen hero. The Houston sun was relentless as it beat down on the quiet streets, casting a golden glow over the small brick building of Haven, a shelter for veterans who had nowhere else to turn. It stood on a quiet corner of the city, not much different from the other buildings around it. But inside it was a sanctuary, a place where men and women who had fought for their country could find solace. These were the forgotten heroes, the ones whose service had ended, but whose battles were far from over. Inside Haven, Nora Beacon Walker moved like a shadow through the hallways. The soft click of her shoes against the tile echoed through the sterile space, but her presence was far from ordinary. Nora had been with the shelter for over 5 years, and in all that time, she had become the heart and soul of the place. While others might have seen her as just another nurse or caregiver, the residents of Haven saw something different in her, a steady presence that brought warmth and comfort in the midst of their own personal storms. Nora wasn't the kind of person who sought attention or accolades. She wasn't there for the praise. She was there for the people who needed her the most. She had seen countless men and women pass through the doors of Haven, some with visible scars and others with wounds that ran far deeper. Some had served in wars long forgotten by the public, while others had returned from conflicts that had yet to be fully understood. But no matter their background or the weight of their experiences, Nora treated them all with the same respect and compassion. That morning, as she moved through the shelter, Nora carried a tray of medications and warm meals. Her movements were quick and precise, but there was a certain gentleness to them, a tenderness in the way she handed each resident their meal or administered their medicine. She had learned, over the years, that these veterans needed more than just physical care. They needed someone who could see beyond their scars, someone who understood the invisible battles they fought every day. One by one, she checked in on the residents, offering quiet words of encouragement, her voice soothing like a balm for their troubled souls. She knew the stories they carried, each one heavier than the last. There was Thomas, a former Marine who had lost both of his legs in a roadside bombing in Iraq. He rarely spoke, but his eyes always softened when Nora entered his room. Then there was Linda, a retired Army nurse who had seen things in the field that still haunted her at night. And then there was Jack, a former Navy SEAL, whose PTSD kept him up for hours on end, pacing the halls at night, fighting battles in his mind that no one else could understand. As Nora entered Jack's room, she found him sitting on the edge of his bed, his head bowed as if he were deep in thought. His hands trembled slightly, and his brow was furrowed, as if he were fighting some unseen enemy. She approached him slowly, not wanting to startle him, and placed the tray of food on the small table beside him. "Jack, you need to eat something," Nora said softly, her voice filled with concern. Jack didn't respond immediately. He simply stared at the food, his eyes distant, lost in a world that only he could see. Nora had been through this routine with him many times before. She knew the signs, the withdrawn silence, the lost look in his eyes. It was the same every time. The ghosts of the past had a way of creeping up on him, taking him away from the present. "Jack," she said again, her voice gentle but firm, "I'm not going anywhere until you eat. You've got to take care of yourself." For a moment, there was silence. Then, slowly, Jack's hand reached for the spoon. He didn't speak, but that was enough for Nora. She gave him the space he needed, staying by his side as he slowly began to eat. It wasn't much, but it was a step, a small victory in a world that often felt like a constant battle. As Nora watched him, she couldn't help but wonder how many others were out there, fighting their own battles, dealing with their own trauma, yet going unnoticed by the world around them. She had seen the statistics. The suicide rates among veterans were tragically high. The struggles they faced after returning home were often invisible, hidden beneath the surface. It was a war that didn't end when they came home. And Nora, despite the exhaustion and the weight of her own responsibilities, was determined to fight alongside them. The shelter was more than just a place to sleep. It was a lifeline. And Nora was the thread that held it all together. She didn't just provide medical care. She provided hope. something that many of these veterans had long since lost. As the day wore on, the shelter filled with the sounds of laughter, conversation, and the occasional grumble of complaints. It was a typical day at Haven, but for Nora, each moment mattered. Every person mattered. She moved through the shelter like a steady stream of warmth, touching lives in ways that no one could truly understand unless they had witnessed it themselves. But not everyone appreciated Nora's presence. It was something she had come to accept over the years. Some of the veterans, particularly those with deep wounds, had a hard time accepting help, let alone kindness. There were times when her efforts were met with coldness or resistance, but Nora never let it deter her. She had learned long ago that healing wasn't always immediate. It took time, patience, and trust. That afternoon, as Nora entered the common area, she overheard a conversation between two of the veterans. They were talking about a group of bikers who had been hanging around the shelter for the past few days. The bikers were known to be troublemakers, often stirring up chaos wherever they went. The veterans were worried, their voices filled with concern. "I don't like the look of them," one of the men said, his face drawn with worry. "They've been watching us, and I don't trust them." Nora's heart sank. She had seen enough to know that this could lead to trouble. The veterans were already dealing with so much, and the last thing they needed was a confrontation. She knew she had to do something. The bikers were already becoming a problem, and if they were allowed to stay, things could escalate quickly. But as always, Nora remained calm. She had faced challenges before, and she wasn't about to back down now. She had been given a duty to protect these veterans, to stand up for them, no matter the cost. As she moved through the hallway, the sounds of the veterans' voices faded behind her, replaced by the weight of something much more pressing. Nora had a feeling that this encounter with the bikers would be unlike anything she had faced before. She just didn't know how right she was. The arrival of the bikers. The morning had passed like any other at Haven, but the sense of unease that had settled in the air that afternoon lingered. The veterans, many of whom had been through the chaos of war, had learned to trust their instincts when something wasn't right. And right now, something wasn't right. The group of bikers who had been loitering around the shelter for the past few days had everyone on edge. Nora felt the shift too. She knew it was only a matter of time before the tension came to a head. Nora, as always, remained calm, even as the shelter's halls seemed to grow quieter and more watchful. It wasn't just the veterans who noticed the bikers. She could see the fear in their eyes as they caught sight of the leather-clad figures lingering by the entrance. Their presence had disrupted the calm peace that had once enveloped the shelter. The bikers had arrived a few days prior, rolling in on their massive motorcycles with loud engines and angry glares. They'd made it clear they weren't there to seek help. They were there to intimidate, to claim their territory. No one knew who they were or what they wanted, but their presence was unsettling. In the cafeteria, as Nora handed out medications and ensured everyone was well taken care of, the murmur of anxious voices echoed around her. The veterans couldn't stop talking about the bikers. "They've been circling the place, checking us out," Thomas, the former Marine, muttered from his corner of the room. He had a grim look on his face, the kind of expression that told Nora he had seen things that most people would never understand. "It's like they're waiting for something," Linda added, her voice shaky. She had been in service for over 2 decades, but the tension in her voice was evident. She had been through wars, but the danger that seemed to simmer in the air now was different. It felt personal. Nora knew she had to stay on alert. The veterans, as resilient as they were, had been through more than most people could comprehend, but that didn't mean they were immune to fear. The bikers' unspoken threat was enough to shake even the most battle-hardened of soldiers. Nora walked the halls with a sense of purpose, but inside, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. She could feel the shift. The storm was brewing. She needed to know who these bikers were and what they wanted before things got out of control. As evening descended and the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a deep orange glow across the sky, Nora's instincts told her that this was the time to act. She couldn't wait any longer. Something had to be done. Stepping outside into the cooling air, Nora squinted against the fading sunlight, her gaze immediately falling on the group of bikers who had set up camp near the entrance. There were 5 of them, all wearing the same black leather vests adorned with patches and logos she didn't recognize. They were loud and boisterous, their motorcycles revving as they argued amongst themselves. They looked every bit the part of dangerous men, hard, tough, and not afraid to show it. But what caught Nora's attention was the way they were looking at the shelter. Their eyes weren't just filled with curiosity or disdain. There was something colder in their gaze, a deep-seated animosity, like they had something to prove. One of the bikers, a man with a thick, grizzled beard and a patch that read "Iron Wolves," turned his gaze toward Nora. His eyes narrowed as he sized her up, as if he could already sense the resistance that lay in her. Nora held his gaze, refusing to look away. She wasn't afraid of him. As she approached the group, one of the younger bikers, who couldn't have been more than 20, sneered at her. "What's the nurse doing outside? Shouldn't you be inside handing out pills and playing nursemaid to your little soldiers?" Nora's expression didn't change. She had dealt with insults before, but she had learned long ago to stand her ground. "I'm here to talk to you. We don't need trouble at Haven. If you've got an issue, you can leave." The bikers laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that echoed off the walls. The man with the Iron Wolves patch stepped forward, towering over her. He was built like a mountain, his muscles rippling beneath his leather jacket, but it wasn't his size that made Nora feel the weight of the situation. It was the menace in his eyes. "You don't tell us what to do, sweetheart," he growled. "We came here for a reason. You think a little speech is going to make us leave?" Nora's heart raced, but she didn't let it show. Her hand gripped the strap of her bag tightly, her fingers curling around the edges as she stood her ground. "This place is for veterans," she said firmly. "You don't belong here. If you're looking for trouble, you've come to the wrong place." The words hung in the air, thick with tension. For a moment, no one moved. The other bikers stopped talking, their eyes flicking between Nora and their leader. "I don't think you understand," the biker with the beard said, his voice low and dangerous. "You've got a bunch of broken men here, ones who couldn't handle real life after their time in the service. We're just here to have some fun, maybe have a few drinks. What's the harm?" Nora stood tall, refusing to back down. "The harm is that you're disrespecting the people who sacrificed everything. You don't get to come here and make them feel unsafe. This is a sanctuary." The biker laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that sent a chill down Nora's spine. "Sanctuary? You think this place is a sanctuary? These guys are weak. They couldn't handle what we've seen out there. Maybe I'll teach you a lesson." Before Nora could respond, a sudden noise came from behind her. One of the veterans, Jack, the former Navy SEAL, had come out onto the porch, standing silently with his arms crossed over his chest. His face was hard, his eyes locked on the bikers. "You don't talk to her like that." Jack's voice was a low growl, filled with a quiet authority that made the bikers pause. For a moment, everything went still. Nora's heart quickened, but she felt a sense of pride. Jack was a man who had been through the worst, and he wasn't afraid to stand up for the people who mattered. The leader of the bikers, sensing the shift, smirked. "And who are you?" "Another broken soldier." Jack stepped forward, his movements deliberate and measured. "I'm someone who fought for my country, and I'll be damned if I let you disrespect anyone here." The bikers, now outnumbered and realizing the resolve in Jack's eyes, hesitated. The tension between the two groups was thick, like a powder keg waiting for the spark. But instead of escalating, something unexpected happened. The leader of the bikers, after a long, heavy silence, looked back at Nora. "We'll leave for now," he said, his voice laced with venom. "But don't think this is over." And with that, the bikers started their engines, their thunderous roar filling the air as they peeled away from Haven, disappearing into the horizon. But Nora knew this was only the beginning. The fight for Haven, for the veterans, and for the dignity of those who had served was far from over. The calm before the storm. The next few days felt eerily quiet. Haven, a place that had once been alive with the sounds of conversations, laughter, and the quiet bustle of daily routines, now seemed shrouded in an uncertain stillness. The bikers had left that evening, but their presence had left a mark. The veterans who once found solace in the shelter's walls now walked its halls with a sense of wariness, their eyes constantly scanning for threats that might be lurking in the shadows. Nora could feel it too. Despite her outward composure, there was a weight pressing down on her. The lingering tension was undeniable. She had seen many battles in her life, some on foreign soil, others right here on the streets of Houston. But this was different. This wasn't just a fight to protect the shelter or the veterans who called it home. This was a battle for something much deeper, the very essence of safety, dignity, and respect. Something was coming. She could feel it in her bones, but she didn't know when or how it would arrive. In the days that followed, the bikers stayed away, but their shadows still loomed over Haven. The veterans, particularly those with the deepest scars, began to retreat further into themselves. The once animated common room now felt hollow. The bright-eyed chatter of men and women who had once shared their stories of service was replaced by uncomfortable silence. The weight of unspoken fears and anxiety hung in the air like a dense fog. Nora moved through the shelter with a heightened sense of awareness. She had always been vigilant, but now it was more instinctual. Her daily routines had become a balancing act, ensuring the veterans received the care they needed while keeping an eye on any potential threats. She wasn't just their nurse, she was their protector. And right now, she felt a deeper responsibility than ever to shield them from whatever danger was waiting just outside. Thomas, the former Marine, was the first to notice her change in demeanor. He had been one of the more vocal veterans about the bikers' presence, but lately he had become more reserved, spending hours alone in his room, lost in his thoughts. Nora found him one afternoon, sitting in the dim light of his small room, staring out the window. His eyes were distant, his mind clearly somewhere else. "Thomas," she called softly, knocking on the doorframe. He didn't turn at first, but he acknowledged her presence with a quiet nod. "I'm fine, Nora," he said, his voice low. "Just thinking." Nora stepped inside, her footsteps gentle on the floor. She sat down next to him, watching him for a moment before speaking. "I know you're worried," she said quietly. "We all are. But I need you to know that Haven is a safe place. You're safe here." He chuckled, but there was no humor in the sound. "Safe? You saw what happened. The bikers are just the beginning. This place is a target." Nora's heart tightened at his words. She knew Thomas had seen the horrors of war, but hearing him speak like this, it was a side of him she rarely saw. He was a man who had always prided himself on his strength, on his ability to endure. But this was different. The veterans were vulnerable in ways they had never been before. "I'm not going to let them destroy what we've built here," Nora replied, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "Haven is a place for healing, and I won't let anyone take that away from you." For a moment, Thomas didn't say anything. Then he turned to face her, his eyes softening. "You're one of the few things that keeps this place together, Nora. You know that, right?" Her heart swelled at his words, but she knew she couldn't let her emotions cloud her judgment. She had a responsibility to the veterans, to Haven, and to herself. She couldn't afford to let fear take over. "I'll keep it together," she said firmly. "But I need you to help me, Thomas. I need you to stay strong. We can't let fear control us." Thomas looked at her for a long time, his weathered face etched with lines of pain, but there was a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "You're right. We've been through worse. We can handle this." Nora stood up, giving him a nod. "I'm here always. And I won't let anyone harm this place." That night, as the shelter settled into its usual quiet routine, Nora couldn't shake the feeling that the calm they had experienced over the past few days was only temporary. She knew something was coming, and it was only a matter of time before it came crashing down. The sound of motorcycles broke the stillness late one evening. It was a sound Nora had come to dread. At first, it was faint, a distant hum of engines that slowly grew louder, closer, until the ground seemed to vibrate underfoot. Her heart skipped a beat, and without thinking, she moved quickly toward the entrance. She had no idea how the bikers had found their way back, but she knew one thing: they weren't here for peace. Outside, the night was cool, the air heavy with anticipation. Nora stepped out onto the porch, her eyes scanning the dark street. There, just beyond the gates of the shelter, she saw them. Their motorcycles lined up in a row like an army preparing for battle. The same group of bikers, their leather vests glinting under the pale streetlights, their expressions cold and determined. Nora's heart pounded in her chest, but she stood her ground. This time, she wasn't going to let them intimidate her. She had fought battles before, real ones, and she wasn't afraid of a few bikers. As she moved toward them, the lead biker, one of the men who had been particularly confrontational during their first encounter, stepped forward. His eyes locked onto hers with the same intense gaze, but this time, there was something more in his expression: calculation. He wasn't just angry anymore. He was testing her. "You really want to keep playing hero, sweetheart?" he sneered. Nora squared her shoulders, her voice calm but firm. "I don't have time for games. You need to leave. Now." He laughed, but it wasn't a genuine laugh. It was a growl, a warning. "You think you can stop us? You think you have any control here?" "I don't need control," Nora said quietly. "I have something much stronger than that. Conviction. And I'll fight for every person inside this shelter, no matter who you are." For a moment, the air was thick with tension. The bikers shifted, their eyes darting between one another, trying to gauge Nora's resolve. But just as the leader was about to take another step toward her, a voice rang out from behind her. "I'd listen to her if I were you." Jack's voice, steady and strong, echoed from the doorway. His tall figure loomed behind Nora, his arms crossed over his chest, his posture one of quiet authority. "This is her house, and you're not welcome here." The leader of the bikers glared at Jack, his face contorting with rage. But Jack didn't flinch. He held his ground, every inch the soldier who had faced down much worse than a few loudmouth bikers. After a long moment of tense silence, the leader spat on the ground, his eyes narrowing as he muttered something under his breath. "This isn't over," he growled. "We'll be back." And with that, the bikers revved their engines and roared off into the night, leaving behind a cloud of dust and the echoes of their defiance. But Nora and Jack both knew this was only the beginning. The storm was coming, and they would be ready. The breaking point. The night had been uneventful after the bikers left, but the quiet only served to amplify the tension that had settled over Haven. Nora could feel it in the pit of her stomach, a gnawing sense that everything had shifted, and no one would be able to return to normalcy until the threat was gone. The veterans, despite their stoic demeanor, had become shadows of their former selves. The once vibrant community was now a place where fear seemed to hang in the air, suffocating everything it touched. The following morning was heavy with the weight of the unspoken. Nora moved through the hallways with a sense of urgency, checking on the residents, ensuring that they took their medications and had meals. But today, something felt off. She could see it in the veterans' eyes. They weren't just afraid anymore. They were angry. The threat of the bikers loomed larger now, and the fear had transformed into a quiet resentment. It was as if Haven had become a place that needed defending, and its defenders were growing weary. Nora couldn't blame them. They had already given so much. Most of them had fought on foreign soil, sacrificed years of their lives, and some had even returned home with bodies broken, minds scared, or spirits crushed. They had all been through hell. And now, after all these years, they had to face an enemy in their own backyard. The thought gnawed at Nora as she walked down the corridor toward the common room. She had a job to do, and it was one she took with more than just professionalism. It was personal. She had vowed to protect the veterans under her care, but as the days dragged on, she couldn't help but wonder how much longer she could keep the darkness at bay. As she entered the common room, she found Jack and Thomas sitting at one of the tables. They were deep in conversation, their voices low and serious. Their expressions were hard, and Nora could tell they were discussing the bikers. But when they saw her enter, their conversation stopped abruptly. They had come to trust her, but they also knew she was carrying a burden too. "Anything new?" Nora asked, her voice calm but heavy with concern. Jack looked up at her, his eyes weary. He ran a hand through his hair, his posture sagging with exhaustion. "They're watching us again," he said, his voice tight. "They'd been circling the shelter like vultures, just waiting for us to make a move." Nora felt the air in the room thicken as she took a seat across from them. She knew this day would come, the moment when it wouldn't just be about protecting the shelter from a group of rowdy bikers. It would be about standing up, about making a stand that could change everything. "What do you think they want?" Nora asked, her voice low. Thomas let out a long sigh, rubbing his hands together in frustration. "They're looking for a fight. They want to break us, but we're not going to let them. We've been through too much to let a group of punks like them tear down what we've built here." Nora nodded, her mind racing. The veterans were right. They had been through too much to be intimidated by a bunch of bikers. But there was still a problem. These weren't just random troublemakers. They were organized. They had a purpose, and that made them dangerous. "We can't let this escalate," Nora said, her voice firm. "But we also can't let them push us around. Haven is a safe place for these veterans, and no one, not even them, is going to take that from us." Jack's eyes hardened. "We'll make sure of that," he said, "but we can't just wait around for them to come to us. We need a plan, a real one." Nora's mind raced as she considered their options. They couldn't confront the bikers head-on. They didn't have the numbers or the resources for that kind of conflict. But Nora wasn't one to sit idly by and wait for danger to find her. She had to take action, but it had to be the right kind of action. The kind that didn't put everyone in harm's way. "We'll need help," Nora said quietly, her gaze flickering to the veterans around the room. "We can't do this alone." Jack and Thomas exchanged a look, but neither said anything. They knew that bringing in outside help was a risk, but it was one they had to take. "I'll reach out to some people I know," Jack said, his voice steady. "If anyone can help us, it's them. They're veterans too. They know what it means to protect something that matters." Nora nodded. She trusted Jack's judgment. He'd always been a man of action, steadfast and loyal. She knew that with him by her side, they had a fighting chance. The rest of the day passed in a blur of preparations. Nora worked tirelessly, making sure the shelter was secure, coordinating with Jack and Thomas to put together a plan of defense. She reached out to a few contacts she trusted, all former military personnel who might be able to lend their support. The bikers weren't just a threat to Haven. They were a threat to everything these veterans had fought for, and Nora wasn't about to let them destroy that. As evening approached, the tension grew palpable. The shelter had become a fortress, but Nora knew it wouldn't be enough. They needed a strategy, one that would send a clear message to the bikers that they weren't to be underestimated. When Jack returned from his meeting with the veterans he'd contacted, he had the news Nora had been hoping for. Help was on the way. A group of former soldiers, trained and seasoned in combat, would be arriving at Haven within the next few hours. They would be ready to stand guard, to help protect the shelter from whatever the bikers had planned. Nora felt a sense of relief wash over her. The veterans would have the support they needed. And for the first time in days, Nora allowed herself a moment of peace. But that peace was fleeting, for as soon as the relief had settled, the quiet was shattered once again. The unmistakable roar of motorcycles filled the air. Nora's heart skipped a beat. It was them. The bikers were back. But this time, They were not alone. From the windows of Haven, Nora could see the group of bikers circling the perimeter, their engines growling like a pack of predators. But this time, they weren't just making noise. They were preparing for something. She could feel it in her gut. This wasn't just a visit. This was an assault. Nora turned to Jack and Thomas, who had already moved toward the door, their faces grim with the knowledge of what was coming. "This is it," Nora said, her voice steady but filled with a quiet resolve. "We protect this place at all costs." The storm had arrived, and Nora Beacon Walker was ready to face it head-on. The last stand. The air in Haven was thick with tension, the kind that suffocates everything around it. Every small sound, every movement, seemed amplified, as though the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for what was about to come. The veterans, now gathered together in the common room, were silently preparing themselves. Some checked their gear, others paced back and forth, while a few sat quietly, lost in thought, their faces grim and etched with the lines of experience. They had faced the worst the world had to offer, but this was different. This was not a battle on foreign soil. This was a battle for home, for peace, for the sanctuary they had fought so hard to preserve. Nora stood at the front of the room, her heart racing, but her expression calm. She had seen enough chaos in her life to know how to manage herself in times of crisis. She was used to running toward the storm, not away from it. But the storm that was brewing outside now was something much darker, more unpredictable than anything she had ever faced before. As the bikers' engines roared louder with every passing second, Nora couldn't help but feel the weight of the responsibility pressing down on her shoulders. She had promised these veterans she would protect them. But tonight, the threat was not just from a group of rowdy bikers. It was a deep, systemic disrespect for everything these men and women had given to their country. The bikers weren't just here to create trouble. They were here to undermine the very notion of what Haven stood for. "We can't let them win," Nora said, her voice steady but filled with resolve. "We fight for Haven. We fight for every person inside the shelter. This place is a refuge, not just from the world outside, but from everything these veterans have already lost. We don't let anyone take that from us." The veterans nodded, each one understanding what was at stake. Jack, Thomas, Linda, and the others, all of them had seen battlefields, faced impossible odds. But tonight, the fight was different. It wasn't just about survival. It was about dignity. It was about the principle that no one should ever be made to feel weak or powerless again. Suddenly, the door to the common room opened, and in walked the group of veterans that Jack had contacted. 5 men and women, all battle-hardened and ready for whatever was to come. They were well-trained, tactical, and prepared to stand side by side with the residents of Haven. They were more than just reinforcements. They were a symbol of hope in a dark moment. Their arrival gave Nora and the veterans something they hadn't had all day: confidence. The clock was ticking. The bikers were closing in. They were getting closer, their bikes pulling up to the perimeter, revving their engines in a show of force. The growls of their motorcycles were like wolves howling at the moon, ferocious, determined, and wild. Nora stepped to the front of the group, her eyes scanning the faces of the veterans she had come to know and respect. They were all prepared to fight, but there was something else in the air, something deeper. It wasn't just anger or fear, it was pride. The pride of people who had given everything for their country, and who were not about to let anyone disrespect that. "We're not backing down," Nora said, her voice clear and unwavering. "We stand together. We protect Haven, and we show them that they can't break us. Not now, not ever." Jack gave a firm nod, his jaw set. He moved toward the door, and the others followed, their footsteps steady. Nora walked beside them, her heart pounding but her mind focused. She had made up her mind. The time for hesitation had passed. This was the moment they had all been preparing for. She wouldn't let Haven fall, not without a fight. As they exited the shelter and made their way to the perimeter, The sound of the motorcycles grew louder, more menacing. Nora could see the bikers now, clustered in front of the gates, their leather jackets glinting under the harsh lights. The leader, the one with the thick beard and the iron wolf's patch, stood at the front, his eyes locked on Nora and the veterans. He sneered as he saw them approach. "You're still here. I thought you would have packed up and left by now, or are you just too stupid to know when to back off?" Nora stepped forward, her eyes never leaving his. "This is our home. We don't back off. We stand our ground. And if you want to make a move, you'll have to go through us." For a moment, there was silence. The air seemed to hold its breath as both sides sized each other up. The bikers were a tight-knit group, clearly accustomed to intimidation and violence. But they were facing something they didn't expect. These weren't just broken people. These were warriors, each one with their own story of survival and strength. The leader of the bikers let out a harsh laugh. "You think you can take us on? Look at you, broken soldiers, tired and beaten. You're no match for us." Jack took a step forward, his voice deep and steady. "You don't know us. You don't know what we've survived. And you'll learn, soon enough, that you don't mess with us." There was no hesitation now. The bikers began to move forward, revving their engines and circling. But Jack, Thomas, and the other veterans were already prepared. The veterans from Haven had formed a solid perimeter, positioned at key points where they could control the flow of movement. They had trained for moments like this, and now it was all coming to a head. But it wasn't about violence, not for Nora. At least, she knew that what mattered most now was sending a message. A message that Haven would not be intimidated, that these veterans would not be made to feel less than they were. "Enough," Nora shouted, her voice carrying across the chaos. "You're not going to get what you came for. You think you can break us, but you don't even know who we are." The leader of the bikers hesitated, his gaze flicking between Nora and the veterans who stood behind her. There was something in her voice, something in the way she stood tall and unyielding, that caused him to falter. He had expected fear, hesitation, maybe even panic. But instead, he saw defiance. He saw resolve. He saw people who had faced far worse than him and his gang, and who weren't going to bend. For a long moment, the two sides stood in a tense standoff, the sound of engines idling in the background, the air thick with hostility. But then, something shifted. The bikers seemed to reconsider, one by one. They turned their engines off, the loud growl of the motorcycles dying down to a tense hum. The leader of the bikers, his face dark with frustration, glared at Nora, but didn't make a move. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath. Nora's voice was calm but unyielding. "It's over for you. Leave now, and don't ever come back." The bikers exchanged glances, their leader slowly nodding before signaling to the others. One by one, they mounted their bikes and started them up again, their engines roaring to life once more. But this time, they didn't circle the shelter. They didn't push forward. They just left. And for the first time in days, Nora felt the weight that had been pressing down on her lift, just a little. The battle wasn't over, but they had won this round. They had stood their ground, and they had sent a clear message. Haven was theirs. No one would take it from them. As the bikers disappeared into the night, Nora turned to the veterans, their faces a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "We did it," Jack said, his voice gruff but filled with pride. "We stood together, and we won." Nora nodded, her heart swelling with a sense of accomplishment, but also with a realization. This wasn't just about protecting the shelter. It was about reclaiming something more powerful, their dignity, their strength, and the unwavering belief that no one, no matter how threatening or intimidating, could ever take away what they had fought for. A new beginning. The dust had settled, the motorcycles had disappeared into the night, and for the first time in what seemed like ages, the air at Haven was still. The veterans who had gathered outside to defend their home now stood quietly in the aftermath, their eyes wide with disbelief. They had just faced down an intimidating force and come out victorious. But it wasn't just the bikers who had been defeated. In that moment, each of them had faced something even more powerful, their own fears, insecurities, and the looming sense that they weren't welcome in the world they had fought so hard to protect. Tonight, however, they had reclaimed something far more precious than peace. They had reclaimed their dignity, and in doing so, had created a bond stronger than ever. Nora stood at the front of the group, her heart still pounding in her chest. Her body was exhausted from the tension of the past few days, but her spirit was soaring. She had known, deep down, that Haven would not fall. It couldn't. The shelter wasn't just a building, it was a symbol. A sanctuary not only for the veterans, but for everyone who had ever felt forgotten, abandoned, or overlooked. Tonight, they had sent a clear message, not just to the bikers, but to anyone who might ever try to harm or undermine what they had built. "We did it," Thomas said softly, stepping beside Nora. His voice was filled with awe, but there was also something else there: respect. They had been through hell together, but tonight, they had fought for something more than just survival. They had fought for each other. Nora gave a tired but proud smile. "We stood together, and that's what made the difference." Jack walked over to them, his gaze still focused on the empty road where the bikers had disappeared. He was a man of few words, but when he spoke, his voice carried weight. "This is just the beginning. They'll be back. People like them always come back. But we'll be ready." Nora nodded, her eyes scanning the faces of the veterans who had stood beside her. She saw the same strength, the same resolve, that had kept them going through countless battles. But this was different. This wasn't about a mission or a war. This was personal. And in that, she knew there was power. "Tonight was a victory," Nora said, her voice ringing with quiet authority. "But we don't stop here. We keep moving forward. We keep taking care of each other. We keep fighting for this place and for everything it stands for." The group of veterans nodded in agreement, their faces hardening with the knowledge that the road ahead would not be easy. But they had already proven they were capable of standing up to anything the world could throw at them. Together, they were unstoppable. The following days were filled with a quiet sense of resilience. The veterans at Haven carried on with their daily routines, but there was a renewed sense of purpose in everything they did. Nora continued to care for them, offering both medical attention and emotional support, but now she also served as a reminder of their strength. Haven had been more than just a place to stay. It had become a beacon of hope, not just for the veterans, but for everyone who walked through its doors. But the shadow of the bikers still lingered. Although they had been forced to retreat for now, the reality was that they weren't gone for good. As Jack had predicted, it was only a matter of time before they would return, more determined than ever. But Haven was no longer just a shelter, it was a fortress, a place where the veterans had proven their worth, their strength, and their unwavering commitment to one another. They had faced their demons, both internal and external, and had come out stronger for it. One evening, a few weeks after the confrontation with the bikers, Nora stood outside, gazing up at the stars. The sky was clear, the air cool and crisp, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the world seemed still. As she leaned against the railing, lost in her thoughts, Jack joined her, standing quietly beside her. "You know, you were right," Jack said after a long moment, his voice low. "This place is more than just a shelter. It's become a symbol, a place where we don't have to hide from the world. We don't have to be ashamed of what we've been through. We can stand tall, and we can make a difference." Nora smiled softly, her eyes scanning the horizon. "It's not about standing tall, Jack. It's about standing together. We may be broken in some ways, but that's what makes us stronger. We've all been through hell, but we made it through, and we're here to help each other rebuild." Jack nodded, his gaze softening. "You've done more for us than anyone ever could have. I don't think you realize how much we all appreciate you." Nora's heart warmed at his words, but she shook her head. I don't do this for thanks, Jack. I do it because it's the right thing to do. You and the others, you're all heroes. I'm just trying to help you find your way back. For a long time, the two of them stood in silence, looking out over the shelter. The winds had settled, and the stars twinkled brightly above them like tiny beacons in the night sky. There was peace in the stillness, but Nora knew it wouldn't last forever. The bikers might return. There might be other challenges along the way. But she also knew one thing. Haven was no longer just a building. It was a symbol of strength, of survival, and of unity. It would never fall. Not while the veterans, and people like her, were there to protect it. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of life at Haven began to return to a semblance of normalcy. The veterans went about their routines, finding solace in the small things: the morning coffee, the shared meals, the quiet conversations that would occasionally turn into laughter. Nora continued her work as both nurse and friend, offering a comforting presence for those who needed it most. The weight of the past would always be with them, but they had learned to carry it together. And though the bikers hadn't returned, Nora could feel that they were always on the edges of her mind, lurking like a shadow in the distance. But she was no longer afraid. They had shown their strength. They had fought for their home and their dignity. And nothing could take that away from them. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in years, Nora could see a light at the end of the tunnel. She knew there would be challenges ahead, but there was one thing that would always hold true. As long as they stood together, they would never fall. They were more than just survivors. They were a community bound by shared experiences, bound by their love for each other and their unshakable belief that they mattered. And with that belief, Nora knew they would keep moving forward, no matter what the future held.